The following presentation was recorded live by Voices from Jerusalem.
What I want to do today is primarily America, Jews in America, which is a very interesting topic. I can say a lot more about it than I'll have time to say, but just to cover the basic material. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk a little bit, just to end off Jews in Eastern Europe. Tomorrow, I'm not going to be here, but the day after, we're going to do a class on the end of European Jewry in the Holocaust. And the last two classes, the second to last is going to be on Zionism, the history of Zionism, and the last is going to be on the state of Israel, modern state of Israel. Okay, nothing like doing, it's easy. Israel got all of 51 years. We can do it easily in 45 minutes, no problem. Okay. The last couple things I want to talk about are actually nice things. We talked about a lot of depressing things going on in Europe. One of the things I do want to mention is the rebirth of the modern yeshiva, which is rebirth of modern, is sort of an oxymoron. But the rebirth of what we call the yeshiva movement in Europe, that's going to be the model for modern yeshivot. The person who is associated with the establishment of the yeshivot system that we have today is Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac of Volozhin. Okay? And he's a student of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who we mentioned before, that great Jewish scholar of Lithuania. And Reb Chaim is the person who's going to put into place the model that is going to be used for modern yeshivot today. We've talked about yeshivot in Babylon going back over 1,000 years. For most of the time the Jews are in Europe, you don't have any large institutions of central learning. Also in the Middle East, you don't have large yeshivot for a long period of time. The yeshiva system we have today, like Eshet Torah, is a relatively modern invention, modern meaning beginning of the 19th century. Reb Chaim had an idea that one of the ways to revitalize Jewish community in Europe after all the difficulties was to revitalize Torah, and the best way to do that would be to set up a large institution of learning, which would have the best students studying in it together, the best rebbeim, and a standardized curriculum. And that's more or less what we have today in the yeshiva world. He sends letters. The actual Volozhin yeshiva is established in 1803. He sends letters to all of the Gedolim in Europe, asking them to send their best students to him. And the response is very positive, and a large number of students are sent. I think the Volozhin yeshiva at its peak had something like 450 students, which, when you consider the population of Europe, is not, tremendous, but by yeshiva standards, it's huge. Okay, considering Eshet Torah today, we have about 150, 170 bochurim, so that's a pretty good sized institution, and it's going to become the model for all the modern yeshivot in the world. And all the yeshivot we have today, especially in the Haredi world, more or less are founded by students of Reb Chaim. Unfortunately, yeshiva doesn't last too long, actually. It's going to go out of business in the end of the 19th century. Remember I mentioned that during the Haskalah, 19th century in Russia, you had Jews who were actively involved in trying to get their religious compatriots to assimilate. This guy Max Lilienthal I mentioned. The Russian government is going to make a move on the Volozhin yeshiva to adopt a more secular curriculum, as part of making the Jews more Slavic. And by the way, the Volozhin yeshiva, it's a big secret, but it actually did have some secular curriculum. It doesn't mean they're learning Russian literature. But they studied, they had like basic, language skills, math. It wasn't totally yeshiva curriculum. But certainly the Russians wanted them to add in all kinds of things which were not acceptable. So I believe that in the early 1880s, the yeshiva closes. It could be the early 1890s, I'm not sure. But it's open for less than 100 years. But in its time, it becomes the model for the modern yeshiva movement. It has a huge impact. A number of yeshiva, just to mention a few names that you'll hear of, that are offshoots of the Volozhin yeshiva. One is the Mir yeshiva, which was founded in Poland in 1815, which we're going to see that during the Holocaust, right before the Holocaust, the Mir is going to escape via Russia to Kobe, Japan, eventually end up in Shanghai. Really interesting story. One of the most fascinating stories is how the entire yeshiva body managed to escape. And today there's a Mir in the area of Mea Sharim area, in Beis Yisrael, and also in Brooklyn. The Slobodka yeshiva, which was founded in Kovno, Lithuania in 1863. This is a very important yeshiva because out of Slobodka, many of the Gedolim who are going to reestablish Jewry in America, and as we'll see in a few minutes, the resurgence of an Orthodox community in the United States is largely a product of post-World War II. A couple names that you might recognize are people who came before and during and after World War II from the Slobodka Yeshiva. Rabbi Ruderman, who was the founder of one of the Rosh Yeshivot of Nea Yisrael in Baltimore. Rabbi Aaron Kotler, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rabbi Hutner, These are big names. If you know the history of American Jewry and Gedolim, these are the big guys. The Radin Yeshiva, which was founded in Lithuania in 1869. The Rosh Yeshiva was Rabbi Meir Kagan, who's the Chafetz Chaim, who we all know very well, if you study the laws of Lashon Hara, you can't study him without this guy. The Telz Yeshiva, founded in 1875 by Rabbi Eliezer Gordon. It relocated to Cleveland. You can go today and see it. As I mentioned, the yeshivas moved but kept their name. You have the Mir, Telz, all these places. Novardok, which is one of the most significant institutions of this period of time. If you take any class with Reb Berkowitz, he loves talking about the impact of Novardok. It was founded in 1896, and it went on to found a number of yeshivot. Something like 20 other yeshivot came out of Novardok. And the Beis Yaakov system for women's education is also going to be, Beis Yosef, not Beis Yaakov. Beis Yosef yeshiva education system also comes out of Novardok. So we have a whole yeshiva movement. The Volozhin Yeshiva, which is only a flash in the pan, around for less than a century, is going to put into motion a whole movement that's going to create the modern yeshiva world we have today, which today is tremendous. People always like to say there are more people studying in yeshivas now than any time in Jewish history, and that's probably true. And a lot of it is owed to Reb Chaim. Another very important movement that appears at this time, which at its time was a bit controversial, but is today central to all yeshiva curriculum, is the Musar movement. You guys heard of Musar? Eshet Torah is very big on Musar study. And it's a product of Rabbi Israel Salanter, Rabbi Israel Salant, who lived from 1810 to 1883. The main book of the Musar movement is, I mentioned before, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's book, right? Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just. The basic idea of the Musar movement was to change yourself. Based on Torah, make yourself a better person. Not just, some of the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter felt that, a lot of Torah study is very intellectual and devoid from your personal relationship to God. This was a way of bettering yourself. Again, Eshet Torah, we're very big on this, so we do a lot of stuff related to Musar. Being aware of God, studying Sfarim that teach you to build a relationship with God. At the time, it was a controversial thing because it was new. Okay, it wasn't accepted by everyone. It was a bit strange. Everything we see, the more we get into modernity in the Jewish world, in the traditional world, the more closed it's going to be to any changes. But in hindsight, again, we see it's a tremendous movement which had a huge revitalizing influence on the religious community of Europe and America today and Israel. And today, everyone does it. It's totally acceptable thing we study. I want to just go through a list of a couple of names. We don't have time to go into the biographies. There's a lot of important Rebbeim at this period of time. And I want a list of names of people who were associated 19th century Gedolim, besides the ones we mentioned. Rabbi Chaim David Azulai is the Chida. Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, big Hasidic rabbi who died in 1810. When I was in Russia, I went to his kever in Berdichev in Ukraine, which has a little building built around it, which of course was broken into. The roof has a big hole in it. Why? Because a lot of people make pilgrimage to Hasidic Rebbe's tombs, and the Gentiles living figured that the Jews must be bringing money in there. So they broke into the tomb several times to see if there's anything inside. Of course, there's nothing inside, but nonetheless. Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz, who's the Chozeh of Lublin. Rabbi Akiva Eger, very important person in Halacha today. Rabbi Mendel of Kotsk. Rabbi Yitzhak Meir Alter, the Chedushi Arim, very important person in Halacha also. Rabbi Meir Leibush, the Malbin, wrote a very interesting commentary in terms of science and Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter, the Sfas Emes. Rabbi Yechiel Epstein, the Orach HaShulchan, very important posek, died in 1908. Very important work of Halacha. You can buy one volume, Orach HaShulchan. Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, the Ben Ish Chai, if you're into Sephardi Halacha and you Sephardim in the room, that's something you guys study. And Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, the Brisker Rav, and his family is extremely important if you're into Yeshiva University, because the Soloveitchik family, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, etc., that's that big dynastic family that produced a tremendous number of big Torah scholars. So we have a lot of creativity in what is not a very good period of time in Eastern Europe. Of course, those Jews who stayed in Eastern Europe, we talked about how 2.5 million Jews are going to leave in the late 19th, early 20th century. Most go to America, but a lot stay. A lot of Jews stay. The Jewish population of Russia at the end of the century is still going to be over 5 million. Russia meaning that territory they controlled, Poland, all that stuff. It would have been much greater had the Jews stayed, but still the population is tremendous. Those Jews who stay, we see, as we get to talking about World War I and World War II, they're going to be caught in the Russian Revolution, a lot of them, and they're going to be forcibly secularized. Anti-Semitism is not going to go away in Russia. When we talk about World War II and afterwards, we'll see that those Jews not caught by the Nazis, Stalin is going to when he comes into power in the early 1930s, is going to embark on a deliberate policy of anti-Semitism, which is going to follow all the way through. Russian anti-Semitism was alive and well all the way up to the fall of the Soviet Union, and you should know that it's still alive and well today, unfortunately. And we have an unusual situation in Russia where we had a very large percentage of Jews who, living in a hostile environment, nonetheless assimilated tremendously. Because they were robbed of their ability to learn Torah, the intermarriage rate in Russia, despite the hostility against Jews, was as high as in America. I can tell you from personal experience, having been many times to Russia and having lived there for a while, this is quite unusual. Usually when you have anti-Semitism, you don't have assimilation. Here you have, unfortunately, like the double jeopardy. And I just want to read you very interesting. This is from a couple years ago. We know that even after the fall of communism, the mass exodus of a good percentage of the Jewish and part Jewish population, anti-Semitism is very much alive and well. I want to read you. This is from Gennady Zyuganov, who is one of the big leading anti-Semitic politicians in Russia, who basically is one of his platforms is racial hatred, primarily of Jews.
What year?
This is from December of 2 years ago, exactly, 1 year ago. Last year this came out, Jerusalem Post. This is just a quote from him, just to see. We're talking about Jews making up now. There's maybe 1.5 million Jews in the entire former Soviet Union, of whom probably half aren't even halakhically Jewish. But our people are not blind. They cannot fail to see that the spread of Zionism in the state government in Russia is one of the reasons for the current catastrophic conditions of the country, the mass impoverishment and the process of extinction of its people. This is it. Of course, the Jews who have barely survived are the cause for all the problems that Russia has today. Classic case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So we're going to sort of close the chapter on Eastern Europe. We're going to talk a lot about it in the next class on the Holocaust, but we don't have time to go more into the history of the modern Soviet Union. But I want to go across to America now and spend the rest of the class talking about Jews in the United States. America is a very unique country for Jews. Before we talk about America as a democracy, we know it has been a haven for Jews since its inception. Now, initially, I'm not going to go into American history, but prior to America being a independent country, we know it was a British colony. Prior to that, much of it was inhabited by Protestant fundamentalists escaping from Europe, Puritans, Huguenots, from all different parts of Europe. Part of America was a Dutch colony until 1664, actually. New York was New Amsterdam. I mentioned before Peter Stuyvesant. And in 1680, there are all of 23 Jews living in New York, in Dutch New Amsterdam, coming primarily as refugees from places like Brazil. The original Jews in America were Sephardim, who, and as I mentioned before, there's still persecution of Jews in the New World, so they migrate to a place like New Amsterdam, which is a really polyglot of religions and all kinds of interesting Protestant sects and Jews. I mentioned that in 1654 also, Peter Stuyvesant, who is the Dutch governor of New York, tries to expel the Jews. It was New Amsterdam at the time. And I also mentioned previously that the Dutch West Indian Company, which was that organization that was designed to oversee Dutch colonial interests and had a huge amount of Jews involved in it and very significant Jewish capital invested in it, blocked that. But anyway, within 10 years, it's already become a British colony. The Dutch lose a lot of their empire. And they had actually some of it until World War II. And the Japanese even were taking Dutch colonies at the start of the war. But New York is going to evolve from colonies, as we know, in 1776 to an independent country, America, not New York, all of America. And it has a very unique relationship with the Jews. America is the only country, virtually without exception, that is founded as a democracy with an idea of religious tolerance, and therefore never had any state-sponsored persecution of the Jews in any way. And because there's a separation of church and state from the very beginning, there's virtually there's no state's religion in the United States, and therefore no large-scale anti-Semitism, whether sponsored by the state or because of popular movement, which doesn't mean America doesn't have anti-Semitism. There are definitely periods of time in America of anti-Semitism, but the lynching of a Jew or a Jewish pogrom is a pretty unusual thing in the United States. We do have, unfortunately, a few instances of it. But just, George Washington, the first synagogue in America is in Newport, Rhode Island. It was the Sephardi synagogue, the Touro synagogue. George Washington, when it was opened in 1790, during the commemoration of the synagogue, George Washington sent a letter, and I want to read you. This is August 17, 1790. This is a letter from George Washington, at that time President of the United States, to the first synagogue in the United States. He says, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in the land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our path, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." What I want to point out is something very interesting here. First of all, he's paraphrasing from the prophet Micha. That everyone will sit under their vine and their fig tree and none will make them afraid. One of the things you have to appreciate when you study the Jewish impact on America is how much the Bible influences the thinking of the founding fathers of the United States. And I mean founding fathers, not just the people responsible for the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, but many of the colonies in America were founded as refuges for Protestant fundamentalists, as I mentioned, Puritans, Huguenots, Pilgrims, all these guys. And again, it's a very interesting topic. One of my favorite topics to talk about, which we don't have time to go into, is the Jewish impact on America, specifically through the Bible. And if you look at the charters of many of the early Pilgrim colonies and Huguenot, they're literally based on direct interpretation of the Old Testament, not even the New Testament, because many of the founding colonists of America believed that even Protestantism, which was a reform movement, had been corrupted. Certainly Catholicism was totally corrupted, like places like France. And they viewed themselves, people who founded, the colonies in Connecticut and New Haven, etc., and in Massachusetts, viewed themselves as literally reenacting the Jews leaving Egypt. If you read what they wrote, I don't have the quotes in front of me, unfortunately, but they viewed themselves as the kings of Europe were like Pharaoh in Egypt. Crossing the Mediterranean was the splitting of the Red Sea. Plymouth Rock. It was literally, they viewed that as, well, this is Mount Sinai. We are establishing in a new promised land, Canaan, a new country based on the Bible. All of these guys followed. You read the laws of New Haven. It has 15 citations from the Bible, of which 11 are from the Old Testament, because the New Testament they viewed was perverted. The pure biblical origins of Christianity were found in the Bible, and all these guys give themselves Jewish names. You don't find guys named Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all named Jethro and Isaiah. It's very interesting. As a matter of fact, you've heard of the guy Cotton Mather? You ever heard of Cotton Mather, one of the early preacher colonists in America in the 17th century? Cotton Mather is actually Mather HaKatan. Younger? They mispronounced his name, but that's how biblical they were. So we have to appreciate the tremendous biblical influence of these people. This was a country that was really, doesn't mean they loved Jews, but they saw themselves as a reincarnation of the Jews. Yeah, Max.
But the Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of them consider themselves deists and not necessarily...
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second. We get to America, the founding fathers of America. But first we have to appreciate the very deep biblical influence. Also in early American universities, clearly the influence is overwhelmingly all the early universities in America, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Columbia, William and Mary, were all established in 17th, early 18th century as institutions to convert the Indians to Christianity, the Native Americans. Bible study was fundamental to this. All the students of all American universities had not only study of Hebrew, but study of the Bible. You could give, in Yale, you can give all the way through the 18th century, you're allowed to give your commencement speech in Greek, Latin, or Hebrew. The people who spoke, Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale. It's very interesting. I've seen letters written to Mendes Satius, who was the first rabbi in the Touro Shul in Rhode Island. This guy wrote beautiful Hebrew. I've seen the actual facsimile copies of his letters. This is a Christian president of an American university who wrote beautiful biblical Hebrew. So we're talking about people who were infused with the Bible. From long before it became a political issue, that America had the most powerful biblical influence of any country in the world. And to appreciate the power of democracy, we have to appreciate that it's overwhelmingly based on ideas that come from Judaism combined with Enlightenment thought. So it's a very interesting topic. I can't go into too deeply. But when we get to the political development of America in the 18th century, as Max correctly says, virtually all the founding fathers of the American Revolution were products of the university system that stressed the Bible and knowledge of Hebrew and biblical values and morality. That's for sure. Yes, it is true that to a large extent many of them were sort of deists, meaning they were not as into organized religion, but definitely into the idea of a divine intelligence that governs the universe. But they were basically, some of them were very, very religious men. They were very positive towards the Bible. And the biblical influence you can see very clearly in all aspects of America. The first symbol suggested for the United States, and by the way, speaking of symbols, many of the early institutions, and I think it's in Yale's coat of arms. It has God's name in it. There's all kinds of Urim V'Tumim, in which in Harvard and Yale both have Jewish symbols on their emblems. You can see it everywhere. The first suggested symbol during the American Revolution was a picture of the Jews crossing the Red Sea with the motto, "Rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God." The idea that we are doing God's will here. You look at the Declaration of Independence of the United States, or the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, that cracked bell sitting outside Independence Hall. It says, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It's a direct quote from, I believe, Leviticus. I'm not sure what numbers. I'm not sure which. It's about the Yovel, the Jubilee year. So the Jewish influence is everywhere. Look on the money in America. In God we trust. My personal theory as to why the American economy is the world's strongest is it's the only money in the world that has God's name on it as an investment thing. And not even Israel can manage to put that one on it. But even looking at the Declaration of Independence, you see very clearly the biblical influence in America is overwhelming. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The fundamental statement of American government, the world's oldest and most successful democracy, is there's a God who guarantees certain basic human rights. And that is a synthesis of modern Enlightenment thought. Read John Locke, the idea of natural law and divine law coming together, which has made America such a powerful democracy. The idea of this law that no human being can mess with. And it's a fantastic topic, a very interesting topic, how much the Bible has influenced the United States. Now, to go back to the Jews, we know the Jewish population of America at the time of the Revolution is something like 2,000 Jews living in the United States in 1776. And that population is going to increase steadily. By about 1850, there's something like 17,000 Jews living in America. But from 1850, for the next 25, 30 years, there's going to be a big influx of German Jews into the United States. And the population of America goes from, I think it's something like 1850 to 1880 is going to jump from 70 to 270,000 Jews. Okay, and that's a big leap forward, a tremendous, and most of them are going to be living in New York. I think something like 180,000 Jews living in New York, and they're going to be moving into New York by the time, in the mid-19th century, it was all the lower part of Manhattan. The West Side area by Central Park was farmland. Jews are going to settle. The Upper West Side was a community. You know the Dakota where John Lennon lived? It was a building built by German Jews in the 19th century to rival the East Side where the WASPs are living.
What was the year that the population of Jews jumped again? You said it was 270,000 one year?
It's between 1850 and 1880. You have a big migration of Jews coming. And these Jews, by the way, do remarkably well. All these big, Kuhn, Loeb, Goldman Sachs, Salomon Brothers, Seligman, they have tremendous, all the retail business in America. We're talking about Sears, Abraham and Strauss, Bloomingdale's, all of this. It's a very interesting story. Again, you want to read a really good book, get a book by Stephen Birmingham. He wrote 2 excellent books. One is called Our Crowd. It's about German Jews in primarily New York in the 19th century. And there's another book also by Birmingham, called The Rest of Us, about Eastern European Jews who come a little bit later. So they do very well successfully. They set up great institutions. They're going to set up the largest Reformed synagogue in the world, Temple Emmanuel on the east side, still the largest one in the world today. And we're talking about a lot of money. But unfortunately, along with that comes massive assimilation. Virtually the entire German Jewish population that comes is going to be into Reformed Judaism. In 1880, there are 200 synagogues in America, of which 180 are Reform. There's virtually no religious community in the United States, Ashkenazi religious community, a little bit of a Sephardi community. Yeah.
Why did they move to the States between 1850?
Because in Germany, which was Germany is a country that's been historically very anti-Semitic, and America was always perceived as a land of opportunity and a land of religious tolerance, and many of the Jews, a lot will stay in Europe, but many will go there, because just as all the Russian Jews are going to come when they get a chance to leave in the 1880s and 1890s, it's greener pastures. This is the classic wandering Jew, only in this case, the Jew wanders farther than almost any time in history to get very, very far away from Europe. But the Reform movement is going to move the focus of the Reform movement moves from Germany. We talked about Hamburg in the early 19th century and Frankfurt on Main. It's going to move to America. And from the mid-19th century onward, the center of Reform Judaism, which is still the largest movement, I believe, of the 3 movements in America today, is going to move. And the Reform movement in America is going to be more into Reform than even the Reform movement in Germany. And I want to read you the Pittsburgh Platform. This is very interesting because the Reform movement has gone through some major upheavals in the last few years. But I want to read you. This is the Pittsburgh Platform, which is one of the major political documents, philosophical documents of the Reform movement. There have been only a couple of major statements of policy and theology about the Reform movement since it was established, and this is the most significant. By the way, the founding father of the Reform movement in America is Isaac Mayer Weiss, 1819 to 1900, who's a German Jewish immigrant. He was the founder and the first president of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which was opened in 1875. Reform today, by the way, calls themselves the World Union for Progressive Judaism. It sounds even nicer than Reform. World Union for Progressive Judaism. As I mentioned before, it's Reform that called Orthodox, because Orthodox sounds, right, closed-minded, backward, anti-intellectual, medieval. A bunch of smelly old guys with dusty old clothing in murky old rooms with thick Coke bottle glasses reading irrelevant books versus reform, and now it's progressive, It's very interesting, the war of words here. And the struggle is going to be carried on in America, although granted, the reform have a different, and they come to America, they don't find millions of or hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Jews there. There's virtually nothing there. So it's fertile ground for assimilation. But I want to read you the Pittsburgh Platform, 1885, and just listen to this. It's very interesting. Again, when you listen to what these people say themselves, it's definitely far more powerful than me saying it. We hold today that Judaism represents the highest conception of a God idea as taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized by Jewish teachers in accordance with moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. Little red lights just start flashing there. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific research are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its age. We today accept as binding only the moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet and dress originated in ages and under influences of ideas altogether foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. We consider ourselves no longer a nation but a religious community, and therefore expect neither return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state. There you see exactly a restatement of gutting Judaism of any ritual, so to speak, that separates Jews from non-Jews. That's all primitive, they say it exactly. And any of the national aspirations that separate Jews from the Gentile. We want to be fully acculturated into America, just like we tried to do in Europe. We will not be accepted unless we are Americans first. And it's a restatement very powerfully of the same basic idea. And by the way, the first banquet, graduating class of Hebrew Union College in 1883, the banquet was, as we say in Yeshivish, lahakis, the menu. It was a total in-your-face. They served crab, shrimp, frog legs, milk and meat. You name it, it was served. I have a copy of the menu if you want to see it. It was. But
they did that for a reason, specifically to drive out.
I'm saying lahakis. It was done, as we say in Yeshivish, lahakis, to anger. We are making a statement. If you're going to hold by any sort of Jewish ritual, we want you out.
Yeah.
And a bunch of people got up and walked out, by the way, of the dinner. And they're going to go on and form the conservative movement. The conservative movement is uniquely the one originally American Jewish movement, which was supposed to be in between. They viewed the reform as going too far. They gutted Judaism of everything. Now conservative is going to be, it's founded actually in 1886 as, again, opposition. Now you can think of it. Look at the titles. Reform, conservative, orthodox. It's like we're not quite as crazy as those guys on the right there, but we're not totally assimilationist. That's a typical Jewish idea. Anyone who is less religious than me is a Christian and more religious than me is a fanatic. So this is, now the conservative movement, who knows what it would have evolved as if it had been a purely American movement. When I say purely American, they bring in Solomon Schechter in 1902. And Solomon Schechter, being a very important Jewish scholar, 1847 to 1915, he's the person who's involved in the Cairo-Geniza discoveries at Cambridge University. Very significant person, Jewish intellectual involved in that. I mentioned the Cairo-Geniza before. But he's brought in from Cambridge, England, to head JTS. And he's definitely a respected scholar in Jewish history, but he had a very radical idea regarding what Judaism should be. And I want to read his principles, his ideas about conservative movement are going to be the guiding principles for how conservative movement is going to shape up. And I want to just read you what he says. This is Solomon Schechter. This is around 1896. It's an essay called Catholic Israel. Catholic meaning universal, not Catholic meaning the Pope here. And you see, look what he says here. He says, it is not, again, it's much better to let people hear what people say themselves rather than listen to me pontificate on it. But here's what Solomon Schechter says. It is not the mere revealed Bible that is the first importance to the Jew, but the Bible as it repeats itself in history. In other words, as it is interpreted by tradition. Another consequence of this conception of tradition is that neither Scripture nor primitive Judaism, but general custom which forms the real rule of practice. Liberty was always given to the great teachers of every generation to make modifications and innovations in harmony with the spirit of existing institutions. Hence, a return to Mosaism would be illegal, pernicious, and indeed impossible. And now this is very dangerous language here. This, first of all, we have to remember that the make it or break it issue, the great lesson we learn out of conservative Orthodox schism, is the same issue we see with the Karaites and the Tzaddukim. Do you recognize the authority of the validity of the oral law and the authority of the rabbis to interpret and apply it? The conservative movement in theory is saying, yes, there is an oral tradition. The difference, however, is that whereas Orthodox Judaism, because we have this idea of Yeridot Hadorot, going down, right? We get further and further away from Mount Sinai. The courts of today, the rabbis are not in the position to uproot existing decrees of earlier generations, etc. The conservative movement says, yes, in every generation, people can apply the law as they see fit to suit the Jewish reality to modernity. Now, this is a very important issue, and an issue which causes a huge impact. If you look at conservative Judaism today, you see the impact. In theory, the conservative movement does follow a quasi-halachic. They have their own sort of Shulchan Aruch. They have their own Batei Dinim, per se. They indeed say that Jews should keep Jewish law. But in practice, we see that when you make a little hole in the dam, it bursts open. The reality is that in practice, very few conservative Jews keep anything. It's very rare to find a conservative Jew who keeps sort of kosher or keeps Shabbos. Okay, that's the conservative movement, a classic case. They issued a proclamation that they wanted Jews to come to shul, so to drive on Shabbos was allowed if you come to synagogue. Now, Orthodox would never say that. They would say, better you stay home and pray. First, what happened? All it did was enable people to move further and further away from shuls and totally wipe out Jewish communities centered around a synagogue in reality. And now today, I know the conservative, most conservative synagogues in America, they're Beit El. I have a Beit El near where I live. They chain the parking lot shut on Shabbos, and everyone parks on the street. It's very interesting. So the reality of what's happened in the conservative world is, yes, definitely conservative is more traditional than Reform. The liturgy is definitely more traditional. I don't want to go into the whole doctrine of conservative movement, but the reality is in practice, as Dennis Prager says beautifully, and he's a person who, if you know Dennis Prager, one of the leading intellectuals of the Jewish world in America, big popular speaker, he said it beautifully. There are no conservative Jews, just conservative rabbis. Now, but the issue is, again, what you're allowed to do with the oral law. Orthodox Judaism says there are red lines beyond which we cannot cross, and Jews of this generation cannot go and make massive changes to traditional Jewish law unless we have a Beis Din that is of greater number and greater scholarship than a previous Beis Din. So it makes the Orthodox world definitely more conservative and reactionary, but it preserves Jewish observance. Now, I just want to tell you one last story, because I'm not here to whack the conservative movement, but I want to show you one great example of what I think is a very intellectually dishonest thing done. When I first came to Aish Torah, it must be close to, I was talking about 17 years ago, the conservative movement took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. Okay, and in it, they quoted a story from the Talmud, which, allow me to paraphrase, it's a very famous story of Moses comes down from heaven and sees Rabbi Akiva, okay, learning out Jewish laws from the little crowns in the letters of the Torah. Okay, he's sitting in yeshiva and he's showing how you learn this law from this crown, and Moses is shocked. Because he figures he's the guy who gave Kol Torah Kulo, all the Torah to the Jewish people. How is this great scholar Rabbi Akiva, many years, over 1,000 years later, is deriving Jewish law? Okay, and then they stop quoting the Talmud, and conservative movement jumps in and says, just as Rabbi Akiva, living over 1,000 years after Moses, was able to derive new Jewish laws, so too we in our generation do the same thing, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now, why is that dishonest? Because if you read the rest of the Talmud, a student in the yeshiva raises his hand and says, Rabbi Minayan, Rabbi Akiva, where do you know that from? We don't learn Jewish law from crowns and letters. It's a remez, it maybe hints to a law. It's something very complicated and metaphysical to do. But where are you learning this from, Rabbi? Rabbi Akiva says, that's easy. It's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's one of the laws that Moses passed down based on tradition, but they left that all out, of course. The point, and then it says, and then Moses was happy. It doesn't mean his ego was all upset. Someone knew something I didn't. But he thought he'd failed to pass on Torah proper, and he realized Rabbi Akiva was showing where you can hint at laws that Moses passed from Sinai on through a different way. That's a very dishonest thing. Yeah.
He didn't understand any of it.
Sorry?
He didn't understand it. If I remember that quote correctly, he didn't understand what he was saying. But when he heard Rabbi Akiva say that it was passed down from... He didn't understand what was saying. What Rabbi Akiva was saying at that point. He didn't recognize it. And he even said, I think at the end, why, God, if you have this man
Right. Okay, I don't want to go into what's going on in the story. It's very interesting. This idea that Moses forgot some of the halacha. I don't want to get into that. That's not the issue here. But
he learned later on.
No, well, halacha Moshe Mishina means that things were passed down, not necessarily said explicitly in the text or openly said in the Mishnah. But the point being, without going into what the story means, because from the Jewish, there's a lot of important Jewish lessons we learn out of that. But the point is not that Rabbi Akiva was making up new law and applying new things. It was there and it was passed on. Okay, let's not go into it now. I want to get. But the point is, that it wasn't an honest way of doing it. But we have to understand the make it or break it issue is going to be the authority of the oral law and the rabbi's ability to transmit it. So we have this breakaway movement called the conservative movement, which is a very big movement in America today. Now, what I want to end on, I'm talking about the reform movement, which is very, very interesting, is what happened to the reform movement recently. Now, reform, again, is going to become a very powerful movement in America and have a huge influence on American society and a huge influence on those Jews who are going to come from Eastern Europe. As we see, when these Jews start arriving in America, there's going to be massive assimilation of Eastern European Jews precisely because there's no Jewish infrastructure. And not only that, those Reformed Jews themselves are going to assimilate. They just had like the centennial dinner for the founding of the B'nai B'rith. They could not find one Jewish descendant of any of the original members of the B'nai B'rith who's still around who hasn't assimilated yet. Okay, very, very interesting. They're gone. When also Temple Emmanuel on the Upper East Side, there's not one Jewish descendant of the original founding members. Temple Emmanuel's Reformed congregation is comprised entirely of Eastern European Polish Jews who came in the next generation, and they also are assimilating out of existence. But the original members, they're gone. The Reform movement has realized more or less that it has not kept Jews in Judaism at all. As a matter of fact, it's done very little to slow the awesome tide of assimilation and intermarriage in America. So this year, they issued one of the most basic, it's amazing, policy statements, which is a complete about-face. As much as the Reform movement can go, in terms of going back and saying, everything we said previously, we basically have to go and change it. Because without having Judaism permeate our lifestyle in all ways, and Zionism, and Israel, and Hebrew, and all these things, forget it. We're gone. We're doomed. So this is a huge, if you go to Reform website, reformjudaism.com or whatever it is, you can see this platform. But I want to just read you. This is an email I downloaded about half a year ago. It says, let me just read this to you. It says, only 3 times over the last century and a half has the American Rabbinate issued an official platform to help guide the theology and practice of the Reform movement. In November 1885, in Pittsburgh and Columbus, Ohio in 1937, the Centennial Perspective appeared in 1976. Next June, the CCAR, this is already last June, will convene once again in Pittsburgh, where the Rabbinate will consider the adoption of a new statement, the 10 Principles of Reform Judaism, drafted by CCAR President Rabbi Richard Levy, who appeared on Reform magazine's cover. It's great. Wearing a kippah, like looking at a prayer book, wearing a talis and kissing his tzitzit. It's unbelievable. Kissing his tzitzit. When I went to Temple Israel in New Rochelle, I grew up, no one wore it. If you walked in with a kippah, they'd throw you out of the shul. The rabbi, wore a black robe, they had an organ and a choir, and no one wore anything Jewish. Very interesting. Let me read you the 10 principles. Now, remember the Pittsburgh Platform? We deny any Jewish observance. We deny returning to the land of Israel. We're not a nation. We're a religious community. 10 principles. Created by the Holy One, we are seekers after God. Having stood at Sinai, we respond to the call of mitzvot amid modernity. We were redeemed from Egypt to help repair the world, and we are committed to Sabbath, which elevates our work and frees us from it. We are committed to the learning and seasonal celebrations. We are open to expand the mitzvot of Reformed Jewish practice. We are members of a holy people from whom we learn and whom we can teach. Members of a holy people, we are rooted in a holy land. Members of a holy people, we are heirs to a holy tongue. We are committed to the equality of all people of God. It's like, yes, Zionism, Hebrew, observance. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. I don't know. I personally don't think it's going to help, but it's very interesting about face. Yeah.
Just going back to what you were saying about the kind of conservative, and how do the Orthodox in America view conservative? Because I heard something that the Orthodox you're either one or the other. There's no in between. No, the Orthodox movement. Again, how does the Orthodox, to make blanket statements is a bit dangerous, but in general, the mainstream Orthodox movement does not. They might be civil, but does not interact in any way officially with either Reform or Conservative, feeling that both movements are not in keeping with the spirit of what Judaism is about, and it's dangerous to have. I don't want to get into the modern Jewish politics, but there's not a lot of positive interaction. But the important thing to focus on, by the way, is as a consequence of what happens in America, unlike Babylon, where there's 11 years before the destruction, the best and brightest 10,000 Jews go down and set up the infrastructure. When these 2.5 million Jews come to America, there's massive assimilation, and Jews are going to pour into the United States in huge numbers and mostly go right to the Lower East Side.
which, by the way, at the very beginning of the century, there were, in 1880, the Jewish population in New York goes right through the roof. It goes up to, let me see what I have my statistics here. I forgot the exact number. There are 65,000 Jews in 1880 and 1.8 million in 1926. And most of them start off on the Lower East Side, which at the very beginning of the 1900s, there's 64,000 families packed into 6,000 tenement houses. It's the highest population density in the world, the Lower East Side. Also had over 360 schools in it. Very interesting. This is where those of us from America, where their life began, all these push carts, tremendous poverty. And they since spread out to the United States, and we have a very prosperous Jewish community. But what does happen with this community is mass assimilation. Because there's no traditional infrastructure. Okay, there's nothing going on. There's no real Jewish education, no yeshivas. And the Reform Jews of Germany, their major goal is to get the Jews of America to acculturate as quickly as possible. One of the head of the Board of Education of New York at the time is Julia Richmond. There's a high school named after her on 68th Street in Manhattan. She's a German Jewish woman. Very impressive to have a woman who's a Jew, who's the head of the Board of Education of the City of New York. But her big platform was to take these backward Polish religious Jews, these Yiddish-speaking people, get them to learn English, to stop looking different, because it reflected bad on us. If these guys are so openly religious, just like the Reformed Jews in Germany, as long as we have religious compatriots running around speaking Yiddish, etc., it's going to interfere with our ability to acculturate into American society. And Jews assimilate remarkably fast. Most Jews go to work for other Jews in sweatshops in New York and the Lower East Side, and there's nothing worse for a Jew as a religious Jew than having to work for a secular Jew. I can tell you, I know plenty of experiences of people today became religious and had to quit their jobs with Jewish law firms and Jewish accounting firms and work for Gentiles. And we see also in 100 years ago. See the movie Hester Street. If you can get a copy of it, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very interesting insight into what's going on there. Now, by the way, anti-Semitism in America does not, when Jews come in massive numbers, anti-Semitism increases also. America is hit by a depression. We know when the stock market crashes in 1918, America, there's a lot of unemployment. Jews are, of course, going to be blamed. One of the big promulgators of anti-Semitism in America is Henry Ford, who's the guy who spent a lot of his own money to get the Protocols of the Elders of Zion translated and distributed. It was the second biggest selling book in the United States in the 1920s and 30s after the Bible. I want to read you. This is outside Ford Motor Company's Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, 1939. This is the sign. Jews are traitors to America and should not be trusted. By Gentile. And this is what it says in the parking lot. Jews teach communism. Jews teach atheism. Jews destroy Christianity. Jews control the press. Jews produce filthy movies. Jews control money. Okay, this is a very, very nasty thing. And out of this, by the way, again, the Anti-Defamation League is going to be founded in America.
I know, that's what I always say.
So, by the way, in America, guys, United States, yeah, we have a low-level anti-Semitism. Jews not allowed in country clubs and universities, quotas. That's all in place until post-World War II and even after, until the 60s. Jews don't make it in America really until the late 1960s, early 70s. Really totally accepted. Jews in Congress and the Senate, you name it, it's unbelievable. Listen to Dr. Lukens' tapes. He talks all about it. But we see there's definitely a low-level anti-Semitism there. The B'nai B'rith is founded in 1913 to counteract this, the Anti-Defamation League that comes out of it to counteract anti-Semitism in America. The last thing I want to talk about in the few remaining minutes I have is the resurgence of the Torah community, which the first yeshiva in America is 1886. The yeshiva, it's the Eitz Chaim Hebrew School. It was founded in the Lower East Side. Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Yeshiva founded in 1897. This is the forerunner of Yeshiva University, whose motto is Torah Umada, Torah and Science. This is the bastion of modern Orthodox in the United States. And they start producing Orthodox rabbis already at the early part of the century. Rabbi Ari Khan of our staff is a graduate of the Bernard Revel Rabbinical College of Yeshiva University. But the other yeshivot that we're talking about, like Chaim Berlin and Torah V'Dat, all of these yeshivas, those two were founded in New York soon after World War I. But most of the Jewish community, the Orthodox community, is going to come into existence prior to World War II. I mentioned all of these guys who came from Slobodka, these great Rebbeim, Rabbi Ruderman, Rabbi Kotler, Rabbi Kamenetsky. These guys who come as refugees before, during, or immediately, most of them didn't make it by the end of the war. You didn't make it after usually. But either before or during the war who managed to make it out are the people who are going to set up Orthodox institutions of learning in America. And from there we have, of course, it's amazing when you think about how little was in America 100 years ago and what an incredibly thriving Jewish community the United States has become, at least the religious community. Unfortunately, the secular community has been devastated by assimilation. Intermarriage rate is approaching 60% in the United States. I didn't bring the statistics, but they are absolutely terrifying. How many Jews, more than half, are not affiliated with anything? Okay? But the community that is growing, of course, and prospering is the religious community, which, of course, is not paradise, but it's an amazing story of the resurgence of what is now the largest Torah community in the world outside the land of Israel. I don't know where there are more religious Jews. I'm sure there are probably more in Israel now. But it's a fantastic story of Jewish revival, and yet we see another great example of God making the cure before the disease. As the gates of Europe are going to be shutting on the Jews, and we look at the Holocaust, which is the end of the European Jewish community, we'll see that over a period of what is a couple of hundred years, a new haven for Jews, albeit not totally perfect. The cloud definitely is not all rosy and white. We have a massive assimilation, but on the other hand, America is going to be the place where literally millions of Jews are going to be able to find refuge, and during the entire 20th century, it's going to be the largest Jewish community in the world. Okay, that's it. We're going to stop. I'm sorry to race through that so quickly. We'll pick it up on Tuesday with the Holocaust and the end of European Jewry.
You have been listening to Voices from Jerusalem. For a free cassette catalog, in the U.S. call toll-free 1-800-VOICES-3. Our email address is voices@aish.edu. or write to us at P.O. Box 14149, Jerusalem, Israel. Shalom from Jerusalem.